This video was heavily inspired by the work of Canadian demographer Eric Kaufman, especially his book Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? If you are interested in demographics and the interplay between ethnicity, religion, population growth and so on in the modern West, he is the man to read. His books are fascinating. I cannot recommend them enough. The common wisdom of our times says that every younger generation is more liberal, progressive and thus less conservative and religious than the previous generation. You can thus often hear adherents to progressivist ideology speaking in very fatalistic terms about future to their conservative opponents. It is basically futile to resist the ongoing change, and if you do not agree, just ask your kids and grandkids. It is just a matter of time before all the agenda you are so reprehensibly trying to stop or slow down will be pushed through just because of the demographic change. Basically, what they mean is that the old farts with medieval worldview will die off and the younger generations with the proper worldview that belongs in 21st century will finally rule. Now this view is problematic in several ways. People that are saying this are for example not taking the population structure into account. The younger generations are just much smaller than the older ones in many countries in the West, especially in Europe. And that makes them automatically the weaker side in this perceived generational struggle. This will likely be shown by the inevitable generational struggle regarding the pension schemes in European countries, and it would also be the case in the culture wars, if the reality painted by the progressives was true. But there is an increasing amount of hints, clues, and first and foremost demographic studies and theories pointing to a very different scenario in the future. Many researches suggest that while the overall ghost of the times has been and still is decidedly moving in the direction of increased secularization, liberalism and individualism, there is a significant demographic revolution brewing under the societal lid that might sway the tides of societal development to the opposite direction in this century. This potential change has two basic reasons. Practicing religious people have fertility advantage over irreligious or non-practicing religious people, and people tend to carry on with the religious beliefs of their parents, since the propensity towards religiosity is given by a combination of genetics and socio-cultural context, which we both get overwhelmingly from our families. Now, just by the combination of these two factors, the number of religious people in the society should increase and they should dominate, since they outbreed the irreligious folk. So how it is possible that there even was such a massive decline in religiousness during the 20th century, if demographics should incentivize the growth of religiosity in the society? How come that everybody is not religious? Those are questions you might ask, and you would be right to ask them for sure. To find the answers, we must look at the development of religiosity over the Western world since the Second World War. Before we jump onto the subject, I want to clarify certain terminological issues. In this video, I will tend to sometimes use religiosity as a proxy for conservatism, even though I am aware that the two are not identical. There can be very conservative people that are completely irreligious, and there probably are some very religious people that are progressive and liberal. But as for the progressive religious people, I guess that there is probably very few of them. And as for the secular irreligious conservatives, there is likely relatively lot of them. But the correlation between their fertility and their conservatism is harder to support by the data, while the correlation between religiosity and fertility is relatively well documented. So, there certainly is certain strata of society that is genetically strongly predisposed towards conservatism and high fertility, while simultaneously being irreligious, and this group is thus making the processes I will talk about in this video even more pronounced, while not really being shown in the data. So, let's go. In the 20th century, and especially in its second half, religion went through a complete freefall in the Western world, and especially in Western Europe, about which I will talk now. The reasons for this are plenty, but I would say that the most prominent ones are the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and its fallout, the significant growth of living standards for the common people during the post-war economic miracle, as well as long-term peace, the discreditation of most of the traditional worldviews connected with Europe before the world wars, and the damage that the national church organizations suffered by getting too cozy with the state apparatus or specific regimes. As for the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, It was hugely influenced by various mutations of Marxist teachings, and it goes without saying that Marxism do not have any love for traditional religion. The growth in living standards and long-term peace also hugely influences the propensity of people towards religion, because the huge progress in living standards and medical standards greatly diminishes mortality salience. When people do not really fear death, they almost never meet it, and do not really think about it, religiosity declines. The discreditation of all the traditional views prevalent before the World War II, I believe that the broad culture offensive of nihilist Marxist worldviews would not be possible if the hell of the world wars did not kill most of the previously held views on nationalism, European cultural superiority, and of course Christianity. There is a sense that all was tried and all led to the disaster of the world wars in one way or the other. So, there is only atheistic humanism left. As for the last point, so getting too cozy with specific regimes, it is an interesting one. It sure seems that the worst thing that can happen to a religion or a specific church is getting too cozy with the government of the state. If religion is seen as standing above the worldly politics, or is even standing with the people against some foreign force pushing different religion or secularity, religion seems to thrive. But when this tension passes over and the church is now the champion of the state, the popularity of church and the faith goes down substantially. I would say that the best examples of this are Poland, Ireland, and Spain, all historically quintessential Catholic nations. During the communist period in Poland, when the church was the cornerstone of the popular dissent against the regime, which was both aggressively atheist and backed by the Russians, both things seen as hostile and alien to Polishness, the position of the church and the faith among the people was unassailable. But now, when Poland is free and could become the Catholic nation that at least some of the politicians desire it to be, the support for the church is in a freefall, especially among the younger generations of Poles. Most of them argue with the interconnections of church with political power and connected corruption. Ireland's national identity coalesced around Irish Catholicism for many centuries, and it was one of the hallmarks of the Irish struggle against the Protestant Brits. But during the second half of the 20th century, when Ireland was free to groom its Catholic identity, it started to fade away instead. Poland and Ireland are quite similar in that regard. In Spain, Catholicism was one of the pillars of the right-wing authoritarian Francoist regime, and the piety of the people started to rapidly decline after the fall of the regime in the 1970s. It is of course fair to add that the process of secularization was and still is fueled also by the increase in living standards and huge exposure to the globalized Anglophone culture mainstream that is largely secularly humanist and progressivist. But to taint itself with the secular and lowly politics mean to lost the divine. Nevertheless, it seems that contemporary Europe is probably the most secular place on the planet, and it is a truly post-Christian society. While the majority, or at least a very sizable portion, of the populations of many European countries is still nominally Christian, for example 71% in Germany, 64% in France, or 73% in the UK in 2018, it can be argued that the vast majority of these people are really secular. And this nominal Christianity, which they write in the census or some value survey since they were baptized as children and maybe possess some vaguely Christian cultural identity, has almost zero influence on their real-life actions and political leanings. To really find the number of Christians in Europe, it is much more helpful to talk about the practising Christians or churchgoers. And in that case, we get very different numbers. The number of people in the reproductive age, so 18 to 44, that attend worship at least once every month and can be thus called practicing Christians is as low as 4% with French Catholics, 4% with Swedish Protestants, 10% with Dutch Catholics and Protestants, or 18% with Austrian Catholics. Those are very low numbers indeed. And if you visit worship in a Christian church in majority of contemporary Europe, you will find yourself in an environment resembling old folks' home, with the majority of people present being old ladies. Basically, the huge cultural secularization pressure of the last decades made secular almost everyone except the people that are truly hardwired to be religious, by their genetic makeup, upbringing, and often likely by both. In the past, being at least superficially religious and attending church was also a social matter, and people often done so because of fear of condemnation by their surroundings or family members. When this incentive to remain practicing Christian started to fade away in the 1960s, and being religious stopped being the standard, many people abandoned Christianity swiftly. It can be argued that in recent decades, the incentive is probably opposite, since to be a practicing Christian and uphold traditionalist views in contemporary Europe is seen as an extremist and medieval position that should not be tolerated in the modern society. The people that remained true to their faith are people that are thus often actively trying to live life in a way that is in direct opposition to the mainstream secular way of life, that is likely seen as degenerate and sinful. Those people might have been born to a traditional Christian family, or they might have converted later in life, but in most cases, people take over the values of their parents. Now, there is increasing amount of data showing that the decline of practicing Christians is either slowing down significantly or have already flatlined, and since the practicing Christians have significant fertility advantage over irreligious population, it is very likely that after a period of very low levels that we are experiencing now, their proportion of the population as well as their absolute numbers will start to increase. There is, for example, the rise of the so-called charismatic churches. Charismatic Christianity is a form of Christianity that emphasizes the work of the Holy Spirit, spiritual gifts, and modern-day miracles as an everyday part of believers' life. Practitioners are often called charismatic Christians or renewalists. These types of believers have expanded in a rate of circa 4% a year since 1970. There is a significant surge in interest in pilgrimages to pilgrimage sites like Santiago de Compostela or Lourdes, rose sixfold from 1 to 6 million visitors since the 1950s, even though it is fair to say that part of the people just wants to see Insta-friendly place and are not necessarily religious. These processes are best observable in the northwestern European countries when the secularization started first, so countries like Britain, France, Sweden or the Netherlands, because those are the countries where the irreligiosity likely reached its pinnacle, and they will be the laboratory of the development in the coming decades. In the Catholic countries in Southern and Central Europe, the secularization process started later and is often in its earlier phase of steep decline of the nominally religious people, as for example in Poland or Ireland. It is quite likely that the percentage of actively practicing Christians might drop to the very low levels that are observable today in the northwestern Europe, before it will start to rise again later in this century. Now let's get to the actual data about the fertility advantage that practicing Christians enjoy over the nominal Christians and irreligious people in Europe. There is quite a lot of research out there dealing with the subject, so I will try to present what I have found. In Spain, between 2010 and 2015, women describing themselves as religiously unaffiliated had total fertility rate of 1 child per woman. Christian women describing themselves as low in religiosity had 1.3 children per woman, and Christian women describing themselves as high in religiosity had 1.9 children per woman. So, while the high in religiosity Christian women were the smallest group of the three, they enjoyed very significant fertility advantage, with fertility that is almost a double of that of the irreligious woman, and the difference is actually increasing in time. If there was complete retention, meaning that all the children born to women high in religiosity would also be high in religiosity, the secularization of Spain would face some serious obstacles in a few generations, because the number of highly religious Christian women would be stable, while the secular population would collapse. But the retention is of course not complete, which is the hardest part of this whole equation to project. In France, with the cohort of women born in 1940 to 1949, so women that are now between 80 and 71, and thus had children approximately in the 1960s and 1970s, the fertility gap between irreligious women, nominal Catholic women, and practicing church-going Catholics was relatively mild, and all of those women had around 2 children per woman. But then the gap started to widen, in the cohorts of women born in 1960 to 1965, so women that are now 57 to 63 and had children approximately in the 1980s and 1990s, the fertility rate for irreligious women was circa 1.7 children. For the nominally Catholic women, it was just under 2 children per woman, and for practicing Catholic women, the fertility rate stood on 2.5 children per woman. Now, you can clearly see that all the categories reflect the significant higher overall birth rates in France in comparison to Spain, but the fertility advantage still holds. If there was 100% retention, the number of practicing Catholics would expand significantly with every new generation. In Britain, women born in the 1950 to 1959, so women that are now 73 to 64, and had children approximately in the 1970s and 1980s, the fertility gap between irreligious women, nominally religious women, and practicing church-going Christians was relatively mild. And all of those women had around 2 children per woman, similar to France. But in the cohort of women born in the years 1960 to 1965, so women that are now 57 to 63 and had children approximately in the 1980s and 1990s, irreligious women had total fertility rate of circa 1.7 children per woman, and nominally Protestant women had total fertility rate of circa 1.8 children per woman. Practicing Protestant women had total fertility rate of 2 children per woman, while both practicing and nominal Catholic women had total fertility rate of circa 2.5 children per woman. So again, if there was complete retention and no switching, Catholics would expand significantly, while practicing Protestants would remain stable, and nominal Protestants and irreligious women would slowly decline if given enough time. Britain also saw the percentage of church-going Protestants as a share of all Protestants stabilize in the cohorts of Brits born in the 1960 to 1969, and even grow a little among the cohorts born in the 1970 to 1979, after decades of decline, and the percentage of church-going Catholics as a share of all Catholics also increased in the 1970 to 1979 cohorts, after decades of decline. In the Netherlands, among the women born in the 1960 to 1965, so again, women that are now 57 to 63 and had children approximately in the 1980s and 1990s, the irreligious women had total fertility rate of circa 1.6 children per woman. Nominal Catholic and nominal Protestant women had total fertility rate of 1.8 children per woman. Practicing Catholic women and nominal members of Dutch Reformed Church, which is the most mainstream church in the Netherlands, had fertility around 2.3 to 2.4 children per woman, while practicing Protestant women had total fertility rate of 2.6 children per woman, and practicing members of the Dutch Reformed Church had total fertility rate of whopping 3.1 children per woman. Among Dutch conservative Protestants, the percentage of church-going conservatives also ceased to decline in the cohorts born in 1950 to 1959 and started to grow a little with the younger generations. Now, if you noticed that there are somehow more categories present in the Netherlands than in other countries, you are right. We are going to come back to that later. In Poland, among the women of 44 years old, so the end of their reproductive age, irreligious women had total fertility rate of 1 child per woman. Nominal Catholic women had total fertility rate of 1.7 children per woman, and church-going Catholic women had total fertility rate of 2 children per woman. So, the breakdown is rather like that of Spain, another Catholic country, where the secularization process began relatively late. In Austria, among women of 44 years of age, irreligious women had total fertility rate of 0.9 children per woman. Nominally Catholic women had total fertility rate of 1.5 children per woman, and practicing Catholic women had total fertility rate of 0.8 children per woman. In Sweden, among the women of 44 years of age, irreligious women had total fertility rate of 0.5 children per woman, nominally Protestant women had total fertility rate of 2 children per woman, and practicing Protestant women had total fertility rate of 2.4 children per woman. So, a fertility advantage of almost 1 child per woman between practicing Protestant women and irreligious women. This study also analyzed France and the Netherlands, which were also analyzed in the previous one, and found out that in France, irreligious women had total fertility rate of circa 1.6 children per woman, nominally Catholic women of circa 1.8 children per woman, while practicing Catholic women circa 2.3 children per woman. While in the Netherlands, irreligious women had total fertility rate of 1.7 children per woman, nominally Christian women of circa 1.9 children per woman, while practicing Christian women circa 2.3 children per woman. In France, one study also shows that among the cohorts born in 1970 to 1979, so people who are now in their 40s and 50s, the percentage of church-going Catholics as a percentage of all Catholics was 8%, while another newer study analyzing attitudes of young Christians in Europe found out that among the French Catholics of 16 to 29 years old, the percentage of young church-going Catholics of all young Catholics was 10%, which implies that there is a little increase among the younger believers. In the Czech Republic, my home country, the data from 2011 census showed that while irreligious women had total fertility rate of 1.4 children per woman, the Christian woman had total fertility rate of 1.8 children per woman. There is no analysis of this matter yet done on the 2021 census, but since the overall fertility in the 2011 was around 1.4 children per woman, and thus basically reflected the fertility rate of irreligious women, since there is very little religious people in the Czech Republic, it would be very interesting to see the difference in fertility in 2021, when the overall fertility rate in the Czech Republic was 1.83 children per woman. If the fertility advantage was sustained, religious women should be safely in the above 2.1 children per woman range, and thus expanding demographically. In the Czech Republic, according to the 2011 census, while the overall number of religious people was traditionally falling, the only age bracket where religious people increased their share were university students. In 2011, among the whole population, religious people were 12%, while among young people of university age, they were 16%. Also, the percentage of young Catholics of 16 to 29 years of age that are active churchgoers in the Czech Republic was 24%, which is one of the highest percentages in Europe. So, while the overall number of young people of Catholic faith in the Czech Republic is very low, only 7%, almost a quarter of them is actively church-going. So, it once again shows that if you manage to stay religious in such a thoroughly secular country like the Czech Republic, you are more likely to take your faith seriously. Also, the 2021 census showed that while the number of people belonging to specific churches traditionally declined, the overall number of religious people, when we count in religious people that do not adhere to any specific church, increased for the first time since the 1989, and the increase was mainly among people under 44. So, in all of the countries that were examined, we can conclude that practicing Christian women have significantly higher fertility than nominally Christian women, and even more so than irreligious women. There are also indications that while the decline of Christianity is ongoing in Europe, the clear majority of people that are leaving the church are the nominal members, which were secular anyway and only maintained their nominal Christianity for cultural reasons or just out of habit. Their switching from Christianity to irreligiosity thus does not really have that big of an impact on their fertility behavior or political views, which were already basically secular. In the countries that started to secularize later, there is much more practicing churchgoers, but there also still is strong decline among the church-going Christians, for example in countries like Poland, Slovakia or Ireland. But in the countries where the secularization began earlier and has progressed much further, we can observe creation of something like a hard core of religious people that is not declining anymore, is church-going and differs dramatically in their fertility patterns. Now, there are two basic scenarios which can take place in the coming decades. Either the secularization pressure will be too strong, even in the future. The children of practicing Christians will continue to turn away from religion and Europe will remain atheist. Or there will be enough children of the religious churchgoers that will stay religious, and in that case, the map of religiosity will slowly, across the decades to come, start to change significantly. This will be even more pronounced by the inevitable decline in populations of many European countries. When the overall fertility in some country is barely more than one child per woman, the religious population only needs to hold to its numbers, or even to decline much slower than the majority population, to increase its share of the population. But since most scientists believe that religiosity is partially heritable, circa 25% to 50%, I believe that the people that remained religious even in the face of the omnipresent secular cultural pressure are strongly genetically predisposed for religiosity, and by having more children than irreligious people, will spread this gene in the population. The other possibility is being part of a religious group that is tightly socially knit together, separates itself from the majority population, and thus keeps very high retention rate and high fertility. Which brings us to the second part of this video. Previously, when talking about the Netherlands, you could notice that there were more categories when talking about the fertility and church attendance of different religious groups. That is because in the Netherlands there are so-called Orthodox Calvinists, a splinter group from the mainstream Dutch Reformed Church that seceded in 1886. They maintained their rather fundamentalist, by the secular standards, way of religion that originated in the 17th century, when the territory that is now called the Dutch Bible Belt was on the front lines of the conflict with Spanish Catholic forces in Flanders. Since the creation of the church in 1886, they remained relatively stable share of Dutch population, around 7 to 8%, which is circa 1 million people today. And that is even though there was massive drop in religiosity overall in the meantime, and the Netherlands is one of the most secular countries in the world. I did not know about this, and it seems completely fascinating to me that hour-and-a-half-long drive from Amsterdam are communities where nearly 80% of residents do not have a television in their home, everything is closed on Sunday, many women wear traditional outfits, half of the youngsters in the town moves from their parents straight into the marriage, and the most popular political party in these parts of the Netherlands is the SGP, which is against abortions, gay marriage, euthanasia, brothels, or women holding office. I can only imagine how these people must feel towards their home country, but I can imagine they must be quite alienated from their homeland, which is thoroughly secular and rather progressivist. According to the researches, the total fertility rate among the Orthodox Calvinists is 2.6 children per woman. The town of Urk in central Netherlands, with population of 21,000 people, is the town in the Netherlands with the youngest population and crude birth rate of 20.3 children per woman in 2018, which is, for example, similar to South Africa, Venezuela or Ecuador, and double that of the Netherlands. It shows that if certain religious groups are not just mere denominations, but are also socially and regionally concentrated, they are much more resistant to the zeitgeist of secularization. I can only imagine how it must feel to be fully confronted with the diverse modernity of, let's say, Amsterdam, after being raised up in a very conservative environment of the Dutch Bible Belt. Another example of such a religious group are the Laestadian Lutherans of Finland. There is approximately 80 to 150,000 of them, and since part of the teachings of the church is ban on contraception, they have extraordinarily high fertility. In the 1940s, their fertility advantage over rest of the non-Laestadian Finnish population in the town of Larsmo, where there is high concentration of Laestadians, was 2 to 1. But by the 1980s, it has climbed to 4 to 1, since in the 1985 to 87 period, the fertility rate of non-Laestadian Finns was 1.45 children per woman, and the total fertility rate of Laestadians stood at 5.47 children per woman. The membership retention of the Laestadians is not known, but their share in the town of Larsmo doubled in 30 years, so they are likely doing a rather good job. But the real paradise of these types of religious groups are the United States. Now, I wanted to concentrate mostly on Europe in this video, since the state of Christianity is significantly different on the two sides of Atlantic. To put it simply, Christian faith is incomparably stronger in the New World than on the old continent. And that goes basically across all the measurable indicators you can find. The demographic reality of American Christianity is rather like that of certain Catholic countries in Europe, where the secularization began later and is now in full speed. The number of active churchgoers in the USA is declining, but the demographic reality of more fundamental women having more babies than less religious or irreligious women have over the decades led to a situation where there is very dynamic core of Christians belonging to various branches of evangelicalism, which is losing numbers due to conversion, but still maintains significant fertility advantage. The estimates of the number of evangelicals in the US differs widely, but it is certainly in high tens of millions of people, and the evangelicals now are 2/3 of white Protestants in the United States, which mean they completely rolled over the mainline Protestant churches during the 20th century. But the religious map of the United States is complex, and I wanted this video to be shorter. So I will talk about the high growth demographic religious groups. Probably the best known group are the Mormons. They inhabit the so-called Mormon Corridor in the west of the United States and maintain significant fertility advantage over the rest of the population, with the fertility rate of Mormons aged 40 to 59 being 3.4 children per woman. 80% of them marrying other Mormons, and they also maintain incredible growth rate of 40% over decade since 1830. There are now circa 6.5 million Mormons in the USA, and Utah, where they are most concentrated, has median age of 31 years, youngest in the United States, and similar to Iran or Indonesia. But Mormons are at least residentially and occupationally integrated into US society, meaning they work normal jobs with non-Mormons and live in normal residential areas, even if there is high concentration of other Mormons in them. But there are other groups that are completely segregated, not just geographically, residentially, occupationally, but they seem to be almost segregated in another time period. Those are groups like the Amish, Mennonites, or Hutterites. These groups can be probably even called ethno-religious, since they are also closely connected to specific ethnic groups of European immigrants from German-speaking Central Europe. The Hutterites live mostly in the upper Great Plains of the USA and Canada. Now, the Hutterites emigrated into the North America in the second half of the 19th century, and from just 400 people, their population rose to circa 50,000 today. That does not seem as that much, but their growth rate is incredibly high, and they still have around 5 children per woman. Same as the more famous Amish. They live completely segregated, homeschool, wear traditional outfits, use far less modern technology, and live mostly off land or simple manufacturing. Their member retention rates are very high, and their population is bound to grow larger. You must keep in mind that the population growth tends to gather pace over generations. The growth from 400 to 50,000 people over some 140 years means that they have multiplied 125 times. Would they manage to grow in the same pace for another 140 years? There would be over 6 million of them, more than the population of Denmark. The older Amish and all older Mennonites, which are also rather well known, also thanks to Weird Al Yankovic, live mostly around the American Midwest and have staggering retention rates of 85 to 90%. And together with their high birth rates, their population growth is staggering. Both groups have birth rates of well over 5 children per woman, even 9 in some communities. And the older Amish grew from 5,000 people in 1900 to 370,000 in 2022. Over the past 100 years, the Amish population has doubled every 20 years on average. The Amish have kept their growth rate for over 100 years, and little evidence points to this growth rate changing. If the Amish would continue to grow at their current rate, then they would surpass the current United States population, which is almost 330 million people, in 215 years, provided no other factors impact or change the current growth rate. Now, I'm not claiming that this will happen, and I'm aware that it sounds insane, mostly because such a magnitude of population would not be able to peacefully coexist with the majority population, and the land would not be able to provide them with the livelihood. But even if the growth rates will inevitably slow down, their incredible population growth shows that even in the current secular world, groups that segregate themselves from the majority population and do not let the modernity creep into their communities can be incredibly demographically successful, and their share of the US population will increase inevitably. And even if only a fraction of the 330 million people scenario would become reality, having Amish population in tens of millions would be indeed very interesting development. Another group that is taking a similar route are the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, the United States and the UK. In 1948, there were about 35 to 45,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. By 1980, ultra-Orthodox Jews made up 4% of the Israeli population. Ultra-Orthodox Jews made up 10% of the Israeli population in 2009, with 750,000 out of 7.5 million Israelis. By 2014, that figure had risen to 11%, with over 900,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews out of a total Israeli population of 8,180,000. The number of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel exceeded 1 million in 2017, making up 12% of the population of Israel. In 2019, ultra-Orthodox Jews reached a population of over 1.1 million, and by the end of 2021, it reached over 1,200,000, or 13% of the total population. By 2030, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community is projected to make up 16% of the total population, and by 2065, a third of the Israeli population. That is a meteoric rise that is caused mostly by very high birth rates, around 7 children per woman, and very high retention rates. Bear in mind that the ultra-Orthodox Jews basically do not work and do not serve in the army. It will be interesting to see how will Israel deal with the enormous demographic and societal change, but it will be challenging to say the least. In the United States, the trend is rather similar. The United States has the second largest ultra-Orthodox Jewish population, which has a growth rate that doubles the population every 20 years. In the year 2000, there was 360,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews in the United States, 7.2% of the approximately 5 million Jews in the United States. By 2006, demographers estimated the number had grown to over 460,000, so 30% increase and 9.4% of all US Jews. In 2013, it has been estimated that there were 530,000 Orthodox Jews in the United States, or 10% of all American Jews. In 2020, there were circa 700,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews in the United States, or 12% of all US Jewish population. In a couple of decades, we might see the highly integrated and successful secular Jewish people that we often connect with the American Jews to be replaced by a very different stereotypical representative of this ethno-religious group. In the UK, a 2007 study asserted that 3 out of 4 British Jewish births were by ultra-Orthodox Jews, who then accounted for 17% of British Jews, 45,000 out of around 275,000. The Board of Deputies of British Jews has predicted that the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community will become the largest group in English Jewry within the next 3 decades. In comparison with the national average of 2.4 children per family, ultra-Orthodox Jewish families have an average of 5.9 children, and, consequently, the population distribution is heavily biased to the under 20-year-olds. So, as you can see, if you connect religious fervor with separation from the norms of the mainstream society and create a heavily family, ethno-religious oriented group, you can start to do demographic wonders. So, as we examined in the previous chapters, the future of Christianity in Europe might not be so clear-cut as it might seem from the development of the past century. The fertility advantage of practicing Christians holds in all the countries examined, and I believe that even though the situation now really does look grim for the faith of our ancestors, the demographic forces are on the side of Christianity. The irreligious populations have sub-replacement fertility all over the continent, and as the populations of Europe age and decline, this decline will be distorted towards much faster decline of the irreligious populations that have very low birth rates. If the practicing Christians manage to keep the retention high enough to keep growing, it will be very interesting to see the debate on religious matters in Europe in the future. Now, I have purposefully restricted this analysis to the native European populations, but there will inevitably be interactions with the growing populations of immigration background, which are overwhelmingly religious. Many of the immigrants in European countries from Africa are Christians, most often of Protestant denominations, and we might in time see alliances of native Christians and people of immigration background regarding subjects like abortions or LGBT rights. These scenarios might even include Muslims. But since native practicing Christians are on average more nationalistic and anti-immigration than the overall population, there is certain contradiction in play here. There are multiple scenarios I can imagine here. The possible ethno-cultural conflicts caused by decades of immigration might harden the divides between the members of different ethno-religious groups, which happens rather often in such situations. Native Europeans might also start to practice Christianity more, since they would look at it as a form of cultural marking, demarcating their in-group. Or the groups will figure out that practicing Muslims, native practicing Christians, and Christians of immigration background might find common ground against the secular majority on subjects like LGBT rights or abortions. It remains open, but I would say that the times will get harsher in the coming decades, and that usually moves populations in the more religious direction. In the USA, the future looks even more inclined towards religiosity, even if the current trends do not seem to support it at the first glance. The population of churchgoers with fertility advantage is much larger than in Europe, and the fertility advantage does increase over time. And the wide open, less densely populated regions of North America seem to be an ideal place for the high-growth sects to thrive in and realize their skyrocketing growth. All of this will be supported by the increasing share of Jewish people belonging to the ultra-Orthodox group. It will be interesting to watch, to say the least.